Destiny 2's Beyond Light expansion introduced 3 new subclass branches for the game's first darkness element, Stasis. They're all incredibly fun, but the real question to ask is how good are these new subclass branches compared to the old ones? In my subclass tier list video series, I went through and ranked each of the game's 27 light subclass branches, and now we're going to add the 3 Stasis subclasses to that list. If you haven't seen my previous tier list videos, check them out by clicking the link in the top right now. For this edition of the tier list video series, I'll be using a slightly altered set of rules for adding Stasis subclasses to the list. First, exotic weapons aren't going to play a role in my tiering. Second, not all Stasis subclasses have class-specific exotic armor, so for now, I'll consider the entire pool of exotics with my tiering. And finally, raid effectiveness isn't going to be a factor. The raid meta in Destiny 2 is simple and, in my opinion, uninteresting because it doesn't allow for a wide variety of strategies to be effective or meaningful. With all of that said, let's get started. We're going to kick things off with the Titan's Behemoth. Its melee ability is Shiver Strike. Hold down your melee button to dash forward and release to punch a single target, applying a stack of slow and knocking it back. Targets affected by 2 stacks of slow are frozen. Your super is Glacial Quake. On activation, you freeze nearby enemies. Your light attack is Shiver Strike, and your heavy attack slams your fist into the ground, freezing nearby enemies and creating a shockwave that spawns stasis crystals. For your aspects, we have Tectonic Harvest. It causes shattering stasis crystals to create a stasis shard that, when collected, reduces the cooldown of your melee. And your second aspect is Cryoclasm. Your slide has increased range, and sliding into stasis crystals or frozen enemies will shatter them. Now, all 3 Stasis subclasses have access to the same 6 fragments which function like passive abilities. They also have access to the same 3 grenades, Cold Snap, Duskfield, and Glacier, but because both aspects available on the Behemoth interact with stasis crystals, and the only way to create them is with the Glacier grenade, that's the most logical choice for your grenade. This makes the subclass feel a little bit one note, but within that single note there's a lot of room to play, and the strategies within that space are effective. Glacier grenades can be used for offense, defense, or crowd control. Throw it into the center of a pack of red bars, then slide through it for AoE damage. If your barricade is on cooldown and you need cover, throw one in front of you for protection. Finally, if there's a champion or other freezable enemy pushing you and you aren't ready to deal with it, a well-placed Glacier grenade will stop it in its tracks. Moving on to one of the unique aspects of the Behemoth, the Shiver Strike melee is unfortunately one of the weaker parts of the Behemoth's kit, and I found myself not enjoying it at all. Its damage is horribly low, and in general it isn't worth the risk to use it, especially considering it won't even freeze enemies on hit. I'd be a lot more inclined to fly into a crowd of enemies with Shiver Strike if it froze enemies, or did enough AoE damage to kill multiple targets, or even provided me with damage resistance after hitting something, but in its current form, it's a suicide punch with little to no impact. This unfortunately means Tectonic Harvest doesn't get to shine the way it should. It's reducing the cooldown of a melee that isn't very good. The Cryoclasm aspect is another lackluster component of the Behemoth. Increased slide distance is a nice utility, but it's not strong enough to drastically impact the flow of battle in PvE, and its secondary effect of shattering stasis crystals or frozen enemies, it's fun, but it doesn't feel like it's enough to warrant me fighting so deep behind enemy lines. Once you crank up the difficulty to Legend or above, shattering a Glacier grenade with a Cryoclasm won't do enough damage to clear out the targets you want it to, and you'll find yourself dying for attempting to complete the Behemoth's main gameplay loop, and that's a problem. The Glacial Quake super is good for crowd control and AoE damage, but like most other roaming supers in the game, it gets completely shut down by boss level enemies. With that in mind, I find it to be a step above other roaming supers because of how long you can keep enemies immobile from a safe distance with the Glacial Quake heavy attack, while also damaging them with the eventual shatter of those crystals. Overall, the Behemoth is a fun subclass that fits comfortably with the other B-tier light subclasses. It can get the job done really well in lower difficulty environments, but it will struggle in higher difficulties because of the ranges it's supposed to fight in. Shiver Strike puts you out of position, but it doesn't do enough damage or provide hard crowd control or defense and doesn't warrant the risk. Because Shiver Strike isn't good, Tectonic Harvest doesn't feel good despite providing solid benefits. Cryoclasm provides nice utility, but it's not game-changing, and finally the Glacial Quake Super is yet another roaming super that feels undertuned. though it gets some points for being able to lock down an entire battlefield by keeping it frozen. Ultimately, the Behemoth is a disappointment. I wish it took a more critical look at close quarters combat in Destiny 2 and made attempts to correct issues that other Titan subclasses have when trying to fight at that range. Healing, damage reduction, crowd control, those are all things you need in order to survive in close quarters combat in PvE, and the Behemoth has none of that, so it can't be anything more than a fun subclass with an intended playstyle that doesn't work in higher difficulties. Next up, we're going to add the Revenant Hunter to our list. Its melee ability is Withering Blade. It's a ranged attack that hits a single target, then automatically bounces to nearby enemies. It applies a stack of slow, and it has 2 charges. Your super is Silence and Squall. You vault into the air and throw 2 blades. The first freezes enemies and damages them, while the second detonates and creates a storm that lingers to damage and freeze targets caught in its radius. Your first aspect is Shatter Dive. You can activate it while mid-air to dash towards the ground, dealing minor damage and automatically shattering frozen enemies and stasis crystals. Second is Winter's Shroud. Your dodge emits a pulse that applies a stack of slow to nearby enemies. The Revenant Hunter is simple and effective wherever you take it, and it has a lot of similarities to other Hunter subclasses. Withering Blade is the best part of its kit. Its pinpoint accuracy makes it great for controlling faraway champions or mini-bosses, and its multiple hit gives it added versatility against packs of minor enemies. This melee also pairs incredibly well with the Winter's Shroud aspect and Gambler's Dodge. While it can be tough to play in close quarters in higher difficulty content, when it's possible, you can dodge near an enemy to apply a stack of slow and reset your melee, then follow up with a Withering Blade for a freeze. This also works well if enemies are pushing you and you need to create space and follow up with crowd control. Shatter Dive is a cool additional ability that does exactly what it says it's going to do, but I sometimes find myself forgetting I have it. This happens mostly when I switch away from the Glacier Grenade. Without the Glacier Grenade, the only thing you'll want to use Shatter Dive for is shattering frozen enemies. But the thing about frozen enemies, they're not hard to shatter, so you don't need a special ability to do that for you. With that in mind, the Revenant feels like it's pigeonholed into using the Glacier Grenade just like the Behemoth Titan, unless you're okay with having parts of your kit not being used to their fullest. The last part of the Revenant's kit is its super, and it's very strong. Its single target damage isn't on par with something like Golden Gun or Nova Bomb, but it has enough additional value from the stasis storm it creates to make up for that. The Lingering Storm provides great crowd control and damage over time for drawn out encounters, and the initial impact damage is still pretty good even though it's not the best. In the end, the Revenant is cut and dry. It's stylistically similar to the Gunslinger's Way of a Thousand Cuts, but it trades damage for crowd control. Its melee is top tier because of its range, accuracy, and versatility. The Winter's Shroud aspect pairs incredibly well with Gambler's Dodge and gets a lot more value than Cryoclasm because of the slowing effect that can be easily followed up with a second slow and a freeze. Silence and Squall is one of the best supers in the game because of its respectable damage and phenomenal crowd control, and Shadow Dive, it's cool and it's fun, but sometimes I wish I had something different. So, what does all of this mean for a ranking? Unfortunately, despite being so similar to the Way of a Thousand Cuts, it's not going to fall into the same ranking, but it's close. The Revenant Hunter is A tier. Because it doesn't have any innate melee cooldown reduction in its kit besides Gambler's Dodge, it feels forced into melee combat to be at its best, but thankfully, when it's in that range, if you can make it work, it's worthwhile. To wrap things up, we're going to add the Warlock's Shadebinder to the list. Its melee ability is Penumbral Blast. It's a ranged attack that damages and freezes enemies it hits and nearby enemies. Its super is Winter's Wrath. Your light attack fires 2 bursts of projectiles that track and freeze enemies on hit, and your heavy attack shatters all frozen enemies in a large radius around you. Your first aspect is Frost Pulse. Casting your Rift creates a shockwave that freezes nearby enemies. Second is Ice Flare Bolts. Shattering frozen enemies spawns Seekers that tracks and freezes nearby enemies. Now, something you may have noticed about the Shadebinder is that all of its abilities instantly freeze enemies when activated. This is incredibly potent for crowd control, but also for damage. The offensive parts of Stasis come from shattering frozen enemies, and since the Shadebinder can freeze enemies easier and more consistently than the Behemoth and Revenant, it gets to shatter them more often, which means it deals more damage. Although the Shadebinder is the only Stasis subclass that doesn't have a special ability to cause enemies or crystals to shatter, it doesn't matter because once again, shatters aren't hard to cause. Now, a really important thing to note about the Shadebinder is that I can recommend other grenades for you without having any caveats. When I make a suggestion for a Behemoth, I always have to say stuff like, if you use the Cold Snap grenade, both of your aspects become less powerful. Or for the Revenant, if you don't have a Glacier grenade, you don't really need Shatter Dive. But with the Shadebinder, all of the grenades have different values and different playstyles associated with them. I've been getting the most enjoyment out of the Cold Snap grenade and its interactions with the Ice Flare Bolt's passive. I throw down a Cold Snap and freeze a few enemies, shatter them, and watch the Seeker projectiles search out new targets to freeze, and you can chain these freezes for multiple enemies. Speaking of freezing, the Shadebinder is better at freezing than the Behemoth and the Revenant. Its melee ability is an instant freeze. Its Rift activation is a freeze because of the Frost Pulse aspect. The Cold Snap grenade is easier to use than a Glacier grenade, and I won't feel like I'm hindering aspects of my kit because I'm using it, and it freezes enemies instantly. Ice Flare Bolts freeze enemies. Everything you do when you're playing the Shadebinder freezes enemies, and this is incredibly strong. Last but definitely not least for the Shadebinder's kit is the Winter's Wrath Super. It's a roaming super that suffers from a lot of the same problems as other roaming supers. No surprises there, but it's not bad. You can use it to freeze an entire room, then shatter them all simultaneously, or slowly whittle down tougher enemies with a continuous assault, and you can do so from the safety of range. To wrap things up, the Shadebinder is the pinnacle of Stasis. The Behemoth is great for breaking things, especially at close range, but it can't fight at close quarters and higher difficulties without getting itself broken. The Revenant can slow and eventually freeze and shatter its enemies with the right combination of abilities, and it's strong. But with the Shadebinder, it's all freeze all the time, and that catapults it above its Stasis counterparts, and even beyond some of the light subclasses into S tier. And there we go, the Stasis subclasses have been added to my tier list, and they all wound up on the top half of the list, which means they're all good. The Behemoth is the worst in the bunch, landing in B tier, with the Revenant in A tier, and the Shadebinder going above and beyond and winding up in S tier. I was the most disappointed by the Behemoth because it wound up being another close quarters combat titan that doesn't have the means to survive in that range, and there are no fragments or aspects that allow the Behemoth to play really aggressively in that space in the higher difficulty environments. The Revenant was really close to being an S tier subclass branch, just like the Way of 1,000 Cuts, but it didn't have any means to constantly refresh its abilities without pushing forward and utilizing Gambler's Dodge. Meanwhile, the Way of 1,000 Cuts, as long as you're landing your melee ability and activating Playing with Fire, you can fight comfortably from mid-range and utilize your abilities for some very impressive damage. The Revenant, though, make no mistake, it's incredibly strong. It's just not at the top of the top. Finally, though, the Shadebinder, it has completely blown away all of my expectations, and I love playing it across all the different content in the game. The easy access to freezing abilities is the thing that sets it over the top. The melee, freeze, rift, freeze, grenade, freeze, it all works incredibly well. It has access to a lot of cool combinations with fragments, exotics, and even the mods that you can have in your armor work really well with the Shadebinder, and it's a ton of fun. One last thing to note is that none of the exotic armor that is available in the game currently had any major impacts on the Stasis subclasses such that it felt noteworthy or worth mentioning. In other words, when looking at the Behemoth, none of the exotic armor available for the Titan was strong enough to make me think, you know what, the Behemoth deserves to be an A tier if it has this exotic equipped. Even the Icefall mantle that was made specifically for the Behemoth didn't influence my decision in putting it into B tier. And that same sentiment was true for the Revenant Hunter. So with all of that said, there's going to be plenty more Destiny 2 content coming in the future, so stay tuned for more. And as always, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to support the channel more than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting, you can head over to patreon.com/iBluairJgR to become a patron. As always, the name of the game is Destiny 2, the name of the channel is iBluairJgR. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.